The cold, heavy steel of the master lock was freezing against my bare hands, biting into my skin through the frigid morning mist. It wasn't just a single padlock. There were 3 of them, thick, industrial-grade iron, woven meticulously through a heavy-duty, quarter-inch titanium chain. The chain was wrapped tight, suffocating the polished brass handles of my restaurant's double doors. But the chains weren't the thing that made the oxygen vanish from my lungs. I could cut through chains. I could buy new doors. It was the sticker. Plastered directly at eye level on the frosted, custom-etched glass of my front door was a massive, violently bright red notice. The bold black federal typography screamed onto the quiet, empty pavement of the financial district. Property seized for non-payment of internal revenue taxes. Just below the blaring headline, smaller print cited sections of the U.S. tax code, threatening federal prison time for anyone who dared to tamper with the notice or the locks. I am 38 years old. My name is Eleanor Vance. For the last 14 years, I haven't just worked. I have bled. I sacrificed my entire 20s to blistering commercial kitchens, enduring second-degree burns, 100-hour work weeks, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that permanently changes your cellular structure. I didn't have a social life. I didn't take vacations. I took every dime I ever made and poured it into the brick and mortar of this building. I built Oakhaven from a dilapidated, rat-infested storefront into a multi-million-dollar, Michelin-recognized culinary staple in the city. Now, I employed 42 people who relied on me to feed their own families. Our reservation book was locked solid for the next 6 months. We were grossing just shy of $5 million a year. And in a single morning at 6 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday, it was entirely gone, confiscated, locked behind federal iron. I stood on the sidewalk, the morning fog rolling off the wet asphalt, and stared at the red notice. My breath plumed in the freezing air. I didn't scream. I didn't drop to my knees and curse the heavens. I just reached out and traced the edge of the Federal Department of Treasury seal with a trembling finger, letting the absolute breathtaking reality of the betrayal wash over me. This wasn't an administrative error. This was an execution, and the executioners were currently asleep in a custom-built or luxury mid-century modern home that my hard work had paid for. 3 years ago, when Oakhaven finally exploded into serious, undeniable profitability, my parents, Arthur and Helen, took me out for a celebratory Sunday dinner. Arthur was a retired corporate actuary, a man who viewed human beings entirely through the lens of risk assessment and profit margins. Helen had spent her 30-year career as a senior administrative auditor for a massive logistics firm. They were sharp, meticulous, and ruthlessly organized. Over a $200 bottle of Barolo that I had paid for, they made me an offer that sounded like salvation. "You are a visionary, Eleanor, not a bookkeeper," Arthur had said, his voice dripping with warm paternal pride as he patted my hand across the white tablecloth. "These high-end CPA firms are going to bleed your margins dry with billable hours. Let us handle the red tape. Let us manage your payroll, your vendor escrows, and your quarterly tax filings. Consider it a family favor," Helen had chimed in, smiling warmly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "We want to stay sharp in our retirement, and more importantly, we want to protect our daughter's legacy. Keep your focus on the kitchen, sweetheart. We will build the fortress around your money." I was exhausted. I was drowning in the operational demands of a booming restaurant. I trusted them. They were my flesh and blood. For 36 months, they played the role of the devoted, protective parents to absolute, terrifying perfection. Every single quarter, Arthur would sit in the leather chair in my back office, sipping a double espresso, and slide a beautifully bound, pristine financial ledger across my desk. He would walk me through the complicated tax brackets, show me the exact agonizing amounts being routed to the state and federal government, and hand me the authorization forms to sign. They smiled to my face. They hugged me on Thanksgiving. They raised a glass to my success at my 38th birthday party, bringing me to tears with a speech about how incredibly proud they were of the empire I had built. And every single time I signed those quarterly tax authorization forms, they weren't sending a single, solitary dime to the Internal Revenue Service. They were legally routing my payroll and corporate tax escrows into a phantom shell LLC they had quietly incorporated in Delaware under a disguised holding name. For 3 years, they methodically, systematically, or ruthlessly bled my life's work dry. They siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund a lavish, secret retirement lifestyle, first-class flights to Monaco, a shadow portfolio of high-yield bonds, and a beachfront condo in Boca Raton. They left me completely, catastrophically exposed to the single most unforgiving, relentless collection agency on planet Earth, the United States federal government. They thought I was just a naive, exhausted chef who didn't know how to read the metadata hidden inside a balance sheet. They thought they had engineered the perfect, untraceable family embezzlement, relying on the fact that a daughter would never audit her own loving parents. They thought my life's work was finally, permanently destroyed, and that I would be left holding the bag and facing bankruptcy and potential federal charges for tax evasion. I pulled my smartphone out of the deep pocket of my wool coat. My hands were shaking violently now, but it wasn't from the freezing wind cutting through the street. It was from the adrenaline. I dialed my father's number. It rang twice before his groggy, sleep-heavy voice answered. "Dad," I gasped. I didn't just speak the word. I forced my vocal cords to crack perfectly. I hyperventilated, injecting my voice with the exact frantic pitch of absolute world-ending hysteria. It was an Oscar-worthy performance of a broken woman. "Eleanor? It's 6 a.m, Arthur muttered, clearing his throat, feigning parental concern with flawless precision. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "There are chains on the doors, Dad," I sobbed, leaning my forehead against the cold, in frosted glass, staring intensely at the red IRS sticker. The IRS. They seized the building. They took everything. There are padlocks everywhere. I don't understand. You and Mom said the taxes were paid. You showed me the receipts. I need you here. I don't know what to do. My life is over. There was a microsecond of silence on the line, just a fraction of a heartbeat. But I knew my father. I knew the cadence of his breathing, and I knew exactly what that silence was. It was the visceral, physical manifestation of a vicious, victorious smirk spreading across his face. "Breathe, Eleanor. Do not panic," he said, his voice smoothing out into a calm, authoritative hum. "There must be a clerical error. The government makes these mistakes all the time. Your mother and I are getting dressed right now. We will be there in 20 minutes. I do not speak to anyone until we arrive." "Okay," I whimpered, letting a final pathetic sob escape my lips. "Hurry, please." He hung up. I lowered the phone from my ear. The fake tears instantly vanished from my eyes, drying in the cold wind. The trembling in my hands stopped entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating, predatory stillness. I turned my back to the chained doors of my restaurant and looked across the quiet, foggy street. Parked discreetly next to a broken fire hydrant, half hidden in the shadows of an alleyway, was a dark, unmarked, heavily tinted utility van. I raised my right hand and gave a subtle, almost invisible nod toward the van's black windshield. My parents thought they had spent 3 years setting an inescapable financial trap for me. They had absolutely no idea that for the last 12 months, I had been quietly, meticulously building a federal slaughterhouse for them, and today I had personally asked the IRS to lock my own doors. The bait was set. The rats were on their way. The silence of the financial district at 6:30 a.m. was absolute, broken only by the distant wail of a siren and the rhythmic, aggressive clicking of Helen's expensive Italian leather heels on the pavement. They didn't park their brand new metallic silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class directly in front of the restaurant. They parked half a block down, likely to avoid drawing attention to their own glaring, inexplicable wealth, while their daughter's life was publicly dismantled. My father, Arthur, was wearing a tailored cashmere overcoat that cost more than my entire kitchen staff made in a week. My mother, Helen, had thrown on a designer silk scarf I hastily tied over a perfectly coiffed blowout that absolutely did not happen in the 20 minutes since I called them. They had been awake. They had been waiting for the call. I was sitting on the freezing concrete curb, my knees pulled up to my chest, my wool coat wrapped tightly around me. I had strategically mussed my hair, letting a few strands fall across my face, and I had been rubbing my eyes violently for the last 5 minutes to ensure the whites were bloodshot and raw. I looked exactly like a broken, terrified, 38-year-old chef who had just watched her life's work evaporate into federal thin air. "Eleanor, oh my God, sweetheart, we're here!" Helen gasped, breaking into a theatrical, dramatic half-jog toward me. She dropped to her knees on the cold sidewalk, completely disregarding the expensive fabric of her slacks, and wrapped her arms around my shoulders. She squeezed me tightly, pressing my face into the silk of her scarf. It was the embrace of a devoted mother comforting a wounded child. It was also the exact embrace of a predator suffocating its prey. I let myself go limp in her arms, burying my face, letting out a fractured, pathetic whimper that vibrated against her chest. "It's going to be all right, Elle. Breathe," Arthur said, his voice a low, commanding, paternal rumble. He stepped over us, his polished dress shoes clicking against the concrete, and walked directly up to the chained double doors. He didn't touch the heavy iron padlocks. He didn't look at the thick titanium chain. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting elegantly in the pockets of his cashmere coat. Orphan stared directly at the bright red IRS seizure notice plastered to the frosted glass. I peeked through the strands of my hair, watching his reflection in the dark, custom-etched glass of the door. The reflection didn't show a horrified father. The reflection showed a man who had just successfully executed a multi-million-dollar hostile takeover without leaving a single fingerprint. His jaw tightened slightly, completely failing to hide the microscopic, deeply arrogant smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He was admiring his own masterpiece. "This is insane," Arthur muttered, finally turning back to me, adopting a mask of profound bureaucratic frustration. "This is absolute administrative incompetence. I have every single quarterly filing logged in my secure server, every wire transfer, every certified mail receipt. We paid these animals down to the penny, Eleanor. I showed you the balance sheets myself. But the sign says non-payment, Dad." I choked out, pulling away from Helen's suffocating grip and looking up at him with wide, completely terrified eyes. "They don't just put chains on a restaurant for a clerical error. The notice says I owe hundreds of thousands in back taxes. It says they're going to liquidate my assets, my kitchen equipment, the wine cellar, everything." Helen gasped, placing a manicured hand dramatically over her heart. She looked at Arthur with perfectly feigned panic. "Arthur, what do? We can't let them take her business. We promised to protect her." "And we will," Arthur stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable confidence. He knelt down beside me, placing a warm, heavy hand on my shoulder. "Eleanor, listen to me very carefully. The IRS is a machine. They make algorithmic mistakes, and then they terrorize innocent citizens to cover their tracks. But you have me, and I am not going to let a bureaucratic typo destroy my daughter." He paused, letting the weight of his paternal heroism settle over me like a warm blanket. He was setting the hook. "Here is what is going to happen," Arthur continued, his eyes locking onto mine with a cold, intense focus. "This is a Friday. The federal offices are closed until Monday morning. That gives us 48 hours to untangle this mess. But to do that, I need absolute unrestricted access. The IRS is going to freeze your personal accounts by noon today, if they haven't already. I whimpered, a perfect, pathetic sound of complete surrender, and then buried my face in my hands. They're going to freeze my savings? The payroll account? How do I pay my staff, Dad? You don't, Arthur said bluntly, the mask slipping just a fraction, revealing the ruthless corporate actuary underneath. You don't pay anyone right now. We need to secure your remaining liquidity before the feds drain it. He reached into the breast pocket of his cashmere coat and pulled out a crisp, folded legal document. It wasn't a napkin. It wasn't a hastily scribbled note. It was a formal, heavily legally worded power of attorney document, printed on heavy stock paper, complete with a notary stamp at the bottom. They hadn't just been awake waiting for the call. They had been drafting the final nail in my coffin. I brought this, just in case, Arthur said smoothly, his voice a low, hypnotic hum, unfolding the document and pressing it gently against my chest. This is a temporary emergency power of attorney. It gives me immediate legal authorization to transfer the remaining balance of your business and personal accounts into an offshore shielded escrow account that the IRS cannot touch. I will move the money, protect it, and then I will walk into the federal building on Monday morning and shove my pristine ledgers down their incompetent throats. Arthur is right, sweetheart, Helen whispered, her voice sickeningly sweet, stroking my hair. You need to sign it right now. If you don't, they'll take the money you have left and you'll be bankrupt by lunchtime. We are trying to save you. I stared at the pristine, white legal document resting against my coat. It was a masterpiece of financial manipulation. If I signed it, Arthur would legally drain the last $200,000 of operational capital I had hidden away, wiring it directly into his phantom Delaware LLC. By Monday morning, I would be completely destitute. The IRS would officially own my restaurant, and my loving parents would be boarding a first-class flight to their beachfront condo in Boca Raton, $1 million richer. They thought I was broken. They thought the sight of federal chains had shattered my ability to reason. They thought I was going to blindly sign my own death warrant right there on the freezing sidewalk. I slowly lowered my hands from my face. The fake tears were gone. The hyperventilating stopped instantly. I took a deep, perfectly controlled breath, letting the freezing morning air fill my lungs, dropping my resting heart rate back to a clinical, terrifying baseline. I looked at the power of attorney document, and then I slowly, deliberately raised my eyes to meet my father's gaze. The transition from a terrified, whimpering child to a cold, calculating, 38-year-old CEO was so sudden, so physically jarring, that Arthur visibly flinched backward. "It's a beautiful document, Arthur," I said, my voice completely stripped of emotion, echoing coldly off the brick walls of the empty street. "Legally binding, shielded transfers. It's the exact same corporate architecture you used to siphon $642,000 of my payroll escrows into your shadow LLC over the last 36 months. The absolute deafening silence that followed my words was profound. It wasn't just the absence of street noise, it was the sound of a meticulously constructed, 3-year-old psychological reality completely collapsing onto the freezing concrete. Arthur's hand, still gripping the edge of the crisp power of attorney document, froze mid-air. For the first time in my entire 38 years of existence, I watched the flawless, paternal mask of the retired corporate actuary shatter into a million jagged pieces. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray against the collar of his expensive cashmere coat. His pupils dilated. He didn't blink. Helen, still kneeling on the sidewalk beside me, let out a sharp, confused breath. She looked from me to Arthur, her impeccably manicured hands hovering in the cold air. Eleanor, Helen stammered, her voice suddenly high-pitched, desperately trying to reassemble the maternal facade. Sweetheart, what are you talking about? A shadow LLC? You're in shock. The stress of the IRS notice is making you hallucinate. Arthur, tell her she's confused. I didn't let him speak. I didn't let them breathe. The performance was over. I was no longer the weeping, terrified daughter seeking shelter. I stood up slowly, the joints in my knees popping slightly in the cold morning air. I brushed the dust off the hem of my wool coat, my movements deliberate, clinical, and completely stripped of the frantic energy I had projected just 60 seconds ago. I looked down at them. My mother still kneeling on the dirty pavement, my father paralyzed with a piece of paper in his hand. The power dynamic of our entire family history inverted in a single terrifying instant. 14 months ago, Arthur, I said, my voice dropping into a low, uncompromising register, or echoing off the frosted glass of my chained restaurant. 14 months ago, my primary vendor for imported truffles flagged a discrepancy in a wire transfer. It was a minor thing. A bounced escrow payment of $2,000. I almost ignored it, but I didn't. Instead of calling you, I called a private independent forensic accountant, not a family friend, a vicious, blood-in-the-water professional auditor from Chicago who doesn't care about our Sunday dinners. Arthur swallowed hard. The prominent vein in his neck began to throb rapidly. He slowly lowered the power of attorney document, his eyes darting frantically up and down the empty street, the instinct of a trapped animal finally kicking in. I gave him unrestricted read-only access to the raw data of my corporate accounts, I continued, taking a slow, eye-measured step toward my father, invading his physical space. He didn't just look at the beautiful, bound, physical ledgers you handed me over espresso. He bypassed the paper. He pulled the ACH routing metadata directly from the digital transfer logs you initiated. I paused, leaning in close enough to smell the expensive, oaky cologne on his neck. I wanted him to hear every single syllable of his own destruction. When you execute a federal tax payment, the money is wired through a specific, highly encrypted Federal Reserve routing transit number, I explained, delivering the technical autopsy with the frictionless, lethal precision of a surgeon. But the metadata on the quarterly payments you authorized didn't ping the Treasury Department's servers. The 9-digit ABA routing numbers on those transfers didn't belong to the federal government. They belonged to a private Tier 2 commercial bank in Wilmington, Delaware, registered to a blind holding company called Apex Administrative Solutions. I stepped back, letting the freezing wind whip between us, and delivered the translation that would permanently break him. In simple, inescapable terms, Dad, I said, my voice dripping with absolute freezing contempt. You didn't pay the government. You paid yourself. You used my signature, my trust, and my blood, sweat, and tears to wire $642,000 of my money directly into your own pockets. You let the federal tax debt compound, knowing full well that when the IRS finally dropped the hammer, they would seize my restaurant, not your house. Eleanor. Or stop this right now, Helen shrieked, scrambling to her feet, her designer silk scarf slipping off her shoulder. The maternal sweetness had entirely evaporated, replaced by a vicious, defensive panic. You are completely delusional. We are your parents. We gave you everything. If there is a discrepancy in the routing numbers, it's a banking error. We will hire lawyers. We will sort it out. But you do not stand on the street and accuse us of— I didn't accuse you, Helen. I cut her off, my tone so sharp it practically drew blood. I investigated you, and once my auditor mapped the Delaware LLC, he didn't stop there. He subpoenaed the secondary transfer logs. I know exactly where my payroll escrows went. I reached into the deep pocket of my coat and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. I didn't hand it to them, and I held it up between us. the white paper stark against the gray morning fog. $80,000 routed to a luxury real estate broker in Boca Raton for the down payment on a beachfront condo. I read off the page, not even needing to look at the numbers I had memorized months ago. $120,000 funneled into a high-yield, aggressive shadow portfolio managed by a broker in the Caymans. $30,000 for first-class flights and luxury accommodations in Monaco last spring. You told me that trip was paid for by Arthur's pension payout. You were drinking champagne in the Mediterranean, funded by the sweat of my line cooks. Arthur's face morphed from terrified shock into something profoundly ugly. The mask of the loving patriarch was entirely gone. What remained was the arrogant, a furious face of a white-collar thief who had just been outsmarted by his own mark. "You ungrateful little bitch," Arthur hissed, his voice trembling with pure, unadulterated rage. He crushed the power of attorney document in his fist. "You think you're so smart? You think a forensic auditor saves you? The IRS doesn't care whose bank account the money ended up in. You signed the tax authorizations, Eleanor. Your name is on the restaurant. You are the primary liability holder. They are still going to liquidate this building, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to prove we orchestrated it." He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest, a desperate, vicious smile returning to his face. "You can yell on this sidewalk all you want," Arthur snarled, taking a step toward me, trying to physically intimidate me with his height. "But by Monday morning, you will be utterly bankrupt and we will be insulated. It's your signature on the dotted line. The federal government is going to crush you, and we are going to watch." I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I looked at the heavy iron chains locking my life's work, and then I looked back at the man who had brought me into this world. I let a slow, terrifying, razor-thin smile touch the corners of my mouth. "You're absolutely right, Arthur. The IRS is a machine," I whispered, my eyes locking onto his with the cold, dead certainty of an executioner. "They don't care about family drama. They only care about securing their money, which is exactly why, 6 months ago, I walked into the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and handed a senior federal agent a 300-page dossier containing every single IP address, routing number, and offshore transfer you ever executed from my office." Arthur froze. The vicious smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer apocalyptic horror. Helen let out a small, strangled gasp, clapping both hands over her mouth. "They didn't seize my restaurant today, Dad," I said, the smile fading from my face, leaving nothing but cold, procedural justice. "I requested these padlocks this entire morning, the red sticker, the fake panic attack, the frantic phone call pulling you out of bed. It was a federally approved sting operation." Sting. "They couldn't arrest you for the Delaware LLC without proving you had intent to defraud the primary liability holder. They needed you to attempt to drain my remaining assets while actively lying about the tax debt." I nodded toward the crushed piece of paper in his fist. "And you just brought a fraudulent power of attorney document to a crime scene," I said softly. I didn't need to say another word. Behind Arthur and Helen, across the quiet, foggy street, the heavy side door of the dark, unmarked utility van suddenly slid open with a loud, metallic crash. The sound of the heavy, reinforced steel door of the utility van sliding open was like a gunshot in the quiet, foggy morning of the financial district. It hit the locking mechanism with a violent, metallic clack that made Arthur physically jump, or his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping clumsily against the pavement. 3 figures emerged from the dark interior of the van. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized, and absolute authority of the federal government. They wore dark tactical windbreakers and printed across the back and chest in blaring, high-visibility yellow lettering were the initials: IRSCI. Criminal Investigation. The lead agent, a tall, imposing woman in her late 50s with iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun, crossed the wet asphalt with her eyes locked dead onto my father. In her right hand, she held a digital tablet. In her left, the unmistakable heavy, dark steel of federal-issue handcuffs. The two agents flanking her moved silently, fanning out to block any potential, albeit pathetic, route of escape my aging parents might attempt. Arthur was paralyzed. The crushed, fraudulent power of attorney document fell from his trembling, manicured hand, tumbling lightly onto the dirty sidewalk near my boots. He stared at the approaching agents as if he were watching a firing squad assemble in front of him. The arrogant, wealthy patriarch who had just threatened to watch me go bankrupt had entirely evaporated. In his place stood a terrified, 68-year-old white-collar criminal rapidly calculating the exact dimensions of a federal prison cell. Helen let out a shrill, hyperventilating squeak. She stumbled backward, her designer silk scarf slipping off entirely and landing in a puddle of dirty street water. "Arthur," she whimpered, her voice cracking into a desperate, unrecognizable register. "Arthur, do something. And tell them there's a mistake. Tell them who you are." But Arthur couldn't speak. His jaw worked silently, the color entirely drained from his face. "Arthur Vance," the lead agent said, her voice a flat, uncompromising baritone that completely swallowed the ambient noise of the street. She stopped exactly 3 feet in front of him. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't offer a polite morning greeting. "I am Special Agent Thorne with the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. And for the last 22 minutes, my team and I have been sitting in that van, recording every single syllable you just spoke on a directional, high-fidelity parabolic microphone." Agent Thorne looked down at the crumpled power of attorney document on the sidewalk. She nodded to one of the younger agents, who immediately stepped forward, or produced a clear, sterile plastic evidence bag and used a pair of tweezers to carefully retrieve the paper from the ground. "That piece of paper," Agent Thorne continued, her eyes never leaving Arthur's horrified face, "was the missing link. We had the wire transfers. We had the Delaware LLC routing numbers. Eleanor provided us with the metadata for the offshore accounts you opened in the Cayman Islands. But we needed to prove active, premeditated, and ongoing malicious intent to defraud the primary liability holder of this business." She stepped closer, invading his personal space, bringing the full, crushing weight of the federal government down onto his shoulders. "By attempting to coerce your daughter into signing a fraudulent power of attorney to siphon her remaining operational liquidity, while actively lying to her about the nature of her federal tax debt, you didn't just confess, Arthur. You committed an entirely new felony right in front of us." "It's a misunderstanding," Arthur finally choked out, his voice a pathetic, reedy whisper. The masterful manipulator who had spent 30 years controlling boardrooms and family dinners was completely broken. We were trying to protect her assets. We were going to put the money in an escrow account. The offshore portfolio was an aggressive growth strategy to help her expand the restaurant. "Save the aggressive growth strategy for the federal prosecutor, Mr. Vance," Thorne said cleanly, devoid of any emotion. She didn't buy a single word of it, and she didn't care to entertain the lie. She raised her left hand, the heavy steel handcuffs clinking together loudly. "See, Arthur Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive tax evasion, and money laundering across international borders. You have the right to remain silent." As Agent Thorne began reciting the Miranda rights with the frictionless speed of a seasoned professional, the younger agent grabbed Arthur's wrists. He didn't handle my father gently. He violently yanked Arthur's arms behind his back, twisting the expensive fabric of the cashmere overcoat, and snapped the heavy cuffs shut. The ratcheting click of the metal teeth locking into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my 38 years of life. Helen was hyperventilating now, clutching her chest, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face, abandoning Arthur entirely in a desperate bid for self-preservation. "Eleanor, please!" Helen screamed, falling to her knees again, reaching out to grab the hem of my wool coat. "I didn't know. I swear to God, Eleanor, I didn't know what he was doing. He handled all the banking. He just gave me papers to file. I'm your mother. You have to tell them I wasn't involved." I looked down at her. I didn't pull my coat away. I just stared at the woman who had smiled and toasted to my success while secretly destroying my future. "You were a senior administrative auditor for 30 years, Helen," I said. My voice as cold and hard as the iron padlocks on my restaurant doors. "You built a career, finding missing decimal points in multi-million-dollar logistics manifests. We do not insult my intelligence by claiming you didn't notice $600,000 vanishing from a ledger, but more importantly, do not insult the federal government." Agent Thorne finished cuffing Arthur and turned her cold, predatory gaze to my mother. "Eleanor is right, Mrs. Vance," Thorne stated, pulling a second pair of handcuffs from her tactical belt. "We subpoenaed the incorporation documents for Apex Administrative Solutions in Delaware. Arthur didn't sign them. You did. Your signature, notarized and verified, is on the master deed for the beachfront condo in Boca Raton. You are the primary account holder for the Cayman portfolio. You didn't just know about the embezzlement, you were the chief financial architect of it." Helen let out a gut-wrenching, hysterical sob. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. There was no escape. There was no defense attorney expensive enough to undo the paper trail she had meticulously, arrogantly left behind. "Get up," the third agent commanded, grabbing Helen by the arm and hauling her off the wet pavement. She went limp, her legs giving out from pure shock, forcing the agent to physically support her weight as he wrenched her hands behind her back and secured the cuffs. I stood perfectly still on the freezing sidewalk, the morning fog swirling around my boots, and watched the two people who had brought me into this world being frog-marched toward the open, dark maw of the federal utility van. "Wait!" Arthur gasped, twisting his neck to look back at me as they shoved him toward the vehicle. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a sudden, desperate realization about his own finances. "Eleanor, the money! The offshore accounts. They'll freeze everything. We won't have anything for a defense. You have to help us. We're your blood." I took a slow, deliberate step toward the edge of the curb. I looked at my father, the brilliant, ruthless actuary who had gambled my life's work and lost everything. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I delivered the final, fatal blow with the terrifying, hushed calm of a woman who had already won the war months ago. "They aren't just going to freeze the accounts, Arthur," I whispered, the words slicing through the cold air. "Under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division has the authority to execute immediate total asset forfeiture. They aren't just taking the money you stole from me. They are taking your custom mid-century home. They are taking the Boca Raton condo. They are seizing the silver Mercedes parked down the block. By noon today, the only thing you and Helen are going to own in this world are the orange jumpsuits they issue you at the Federal Detention Center." Arthur's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The absolute totality of his ruin finally registered in his eyes. "Put him in the van," Agent Thorne ordered. The agents shoved my parents into the back of the dark vehicle. The heavy steel door slid shut with a violent, final crash, sealing them inside. The heavy reinforced steel door of the IRSCI utility van, sliding shut, sounded like the slamming of a bank vault. It was a violent, absolute, and deeply permanent sound that echoed cleanly down the quiet, foggy street of the financial district. I didn't move. I stood on the freezing sidewalk, my breath pluming in the cold morning air, and watched the taillights of the van flare red as the driver shifted into gear. They didn't hit the sirens. They didn't need to. The operation was over. The van pulled away from the curb, merging silently into the early morning traffic, carrying the two architects of my financial ruin toward a federal holding facility. At the exact same moment, a flatbed tow truck rounded the corner at the end of the block. It reversed cleanly, aligning its hydraulic ramp with the metallic silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class my parents had parked just 50 yards away. I watched a uniformed Treasury contractor step out, hook the heavy steel winches to the front axle of the luxury sedan, and effortlessly drag my father's $140,000 pride and joy onto the bed of the truck. The physical erasure of Arthur and Helen Vance from the civilized world was happening with breathtaking procedural efficiency. Agent Thorne remained on the sidewalk with me. The imposing, iron-haired federal agent watched the tow truck secure the Mercedes before turning her attention back to the chained double doors of my restaurant. She didn't look at me with pity. She looked at me with the quiet, respectful acknowledgement of a fellow professional who had just successfully executed a high-stakes, flawlessly planned operation. Thorne reached into the pocket of her tactical windbreaker and pulled out a small, heavy ring of keys. She stepped past me, walked up to the frosted glass doors, and inserted the master key into the first industrial padlock. The lock clicked open loudly. She pulled it free, then moved to the second, and finally the third. "The theater is officially closed, Ms. Vance," Thorne said, her flat, uncompromising baritone finally softening by a fraction of a degree. She unwrapped the heavy-duty titanium chain from the brass handles, the metal links clattering heavily against the pavement as she dropped it to the ground. She reached up and grabbed the corner of the violently bright red seizure notice plastered to the glass. With one smooth, deliberate motion, she ripped the federal sticker off my door, crushing it into a tight ball in her fist. "I need you to understand exactly what happens next from a legal standpoint," Thorne said, turning to face me, the crushed red sticker in her hand. "The IRS does not forgive tax debt. The $642,000 your parents embezzled is still technically owed to the United States Treasury. However, because you acted as an active, cooperating informant in a federal sting operation under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the rules of engagement have shifted." I crossed my arms tightly over my wool coat, nodding slowly, letting my racing heart finally begin to settle. "Asset forfeiture?" "Exactly," Thorne confirmed, a grim professional satisfaction in her eyes. "Under Title 18, United States Code, Section 981, civil forfeiture allows the government to seize any and all assets tied to international wire fraud and money laundering. As of 6:15 a.m. this morning, the Delaware LLC, the offshore Cayman portfolio, and the deed to the Boca Raton condo are officially the property of the United States Treasury." She stepped closer, delivering the final technical autopsy of my parents' wealth. "The federal government will liquidate those assets at auction over the next 90 days, Thorne explained smoothly. "We will use the proceeds to completely satisfy the corporate tax lien against Oakhaven. Any surplus funds, and given the current market value of their real estate, there will be a significant surplus, will be legally classified as victim restitution. It will be disbursed directly back into your corporate accounts to compensate for the emotional and operational damages caused by the fraud." Thorne paused, letting the cold morning wind blow between us, and delivered the translation. "In simple terms, Eleanor," she said, a very faint, respectful smile touching her lips, "the government just foreclosed on your parents' entire retirement to pay your restaurant's tax bill, and you get to keep the change. We are done here. You have a kitchen to prep?" Thorne handed me the heavy ring of keys, turned around, and walked down the street toward a secondary unmarked vehicle, waiting at the corner. I stood alone on the sidewalk for a long time. The freezing fog was finally beginning to lift, revealing the pale, sharp light of the morning sun cutting through the skyscrapers of the financial district. I looked at the brass handles of my restaurant. They were bruised and scratched from the heavy titanium chains, but they were free. I pushed the double doors open and stepped inside. The dining room was pitch black and perfectly silent. The air smelled faintly of oak wood, or expensive wine and the lingering ghost of roasted garlic from the night before. I walked slowly through the maze of tables, running my hand along the crisp white tablecloths, feeling the profound, heavy weight of absolute ownership settle into my bones. I hadn't just built this empire. I had gone to war to defend it, and I had won. I pushed through the swinging doors into the massive stainless steel commercial kitchen, reached up, and flipped the master breaker switch. The fluorescent lights roared to life, blinding and beautiful. The massive walk-in refrigerators hummed. The ovens stood ready. It was time to work. 7 months later, the justice system processed Arthur and Helen Vance with the same ruthless mathematical efficiency my father used to worship. Or because Agent Thorne's team had captured their active attempt to extort me on a high-fidelity parabolic microphone, and because my forensic auditor had mapped every single offshore routing number, my parents' high-priced defense attorneys were entirely paralyzed. There was no trial. There was no dramatic courtroom battle. The evidence was so overwhelmingly suffocating that their lawyers forced them to accept a brutal plea deal just to avoid a 20-year maximum sentence. The true destruction, however, didn't happen in the courtroom. It happened in the holding cells. When faced with the reality of a decade in federal prison, the flawless, united front of their marriage completely disintegrated. Helen turned on Arthur, offering to testify that he was the sole mastermind in exchange for a lighter sentence. Arthur retaliated by providing the FBI with a ledger proving Helen had personally forged my signature on the Cayman documents. They destroyed each other, tearing their 30-year marriage apart in a desperate, pathetic race to save their own skin. Ultimately, it didn't matter. The judge sentenced Arthur to 9 years in a medium-security federal correctional institution for conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Helen received 7 years in a minimum security women's camp for tax evasion and forgery. They were permanently, hopelessly bankrupt. Their sprawling mid-century home was sold to a young tech executive. Their country club memberships were revoked in disgrace. Their social circle entirely abandoned them, treating their names like a contagious disease. They tried to call me once from the detention center before their transfer. The caller ID flashed on my phone while I was standing in the middle of a chaotic, fully booked Friday night dinner service. The dining room was packed. The kitchen was roaring. The air was thick with the smell of seared wagyu and truffle butter. I looked at the phone, listened to the rhythmic, beautiful chaos of my empire, and pressed decline. I blocked the number, dropped the phone into my pocket, and went back to the line. If your own parents spent 3 years looking you in the eye, smiling and hugging you while systematically draining your life's work to fund their luxury retirement, would you have given them a chance to explain themselves? Or would you have played their game, hired the auditor, and set a federal trap to watch them lose absolutely everything they owned, right on the sidewalk? Let me know exactly how you would handle this level of family betrayal in the comments below. If you loved this story of cold, calculating justice, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.